everybody, Cheska Cat here for another video. This is part 2 of 3 of me going over this simplicity pattern for a Misses Steampunk costume. In my last video, I made the coat, and in this video, I will be going over how I made the bustier. Just a quick side note, I do have a learning disability called dyslexia. It makes it harder to sound out and pronounce words. Therefore, French words like kernel and bustier that have R's in it, but you don't pronounce the R's, really confuse me. And so I apologize to the French people if in this video or any of my videos I mispronounce some of your words. I am very sorry. It is just that my disability prevents from knowing how to sound them out properly. So hopefully I say bustier correctly throughout this video. So now I will get into materials. The main fabric for this bustier is calico. From what I can understand, calico is a plain woven cotton fabric that is unbleached, and if there are patterns on it, it is usually painted or pressed on. Working with this fabric, I did find it a little stiffer than cotton I have used in the past, but it still worked out in the end. As far as cutting the fabric for the bustier, I will only need pieces 15 through 19 of the pattern. That's only 5 pieces out of the 24 pieces to create this steampunk costume. However, this part of the garment is where I will need the most interfacing and liner. For each piece of the pattern for this bustier, I will need to cut 2 pieces of the main fabric, 2 pieces for the liner, and 1 piece of interfacing. So in total, I cut out 25 pieces of fabric. The bustier was the easiest section of the garment to cut out and did not take that long at all. But it was the last thing I cut, so my back was pretty much killing me by the end of this 2-day process. Because if you remember in my last video, even though this pattern is only 24 pieces, this factors into cutting out approximately 100 pieces of fabric. I need a zipper that breaks apart, so I have this black one. And lastly, for some reason, this last item is required for the bustier, but it is not indicated on the notions on the back of the pattern's envelope. Instead, it is not mentioned that you need this item until literally I came to this step in the directions. And that is boning for the bustier. I found this annoying because I would have liked to know a lot sooner while I was prepping the project that I needed to buy boning, instead of having to stop halfway through the project and go to Joann's to buy that said boning. The directions do recommend using a cheaper type of boning, which is just a boning that is plastic with a polyester slip covering, which only costs about a little over $2 a yard. So I'm not mad about the pricing. Like I said, I would have liked to know earlier in the process that I needed to buy boning for this project. Within step 1 of the directions, they want me to apply the interfacing to the main fabric. And with this, I realized they probably did want me to use iron-on interfacing because of the use of the word fusible. But this woven interfacing is what I have. I can still use this because when I sew the seams in, it will hold the interfacing in place. What I do like about this pattern's instructions is that it starts the step count over at the bustier. However, once again, the same complaint I had in my last video, they aren't providing numbers for the picture diagrams, which meant me puzzling together the pieces based off of the provided picture that already had the bustier sewn together while trying to use the confusing written directions. I'm a visual learner, therefore I find it very annoying that they are not including numbers in this picture diagram, and once again, it's not that hard to add a freaking number. Moving on. When sewing the bustier together with the main fabric, I first sewed together the 2 pieces of 15, which are bustier front. Then on the sides of 15, I stitched on pieces 16, bustier middle front. And then the next pieces are 17, bustier side front, and then pieces 19, bustier side back, And finally, pieces 18 bustier back. Just an aside, the directions to do this are just really freaking confusing because of their usage of the words front and back in two different ways. First, they refer to the actual pattern pieces that use those words in naming that piece, and then it uses front and back to refer to the parts of the garment I am making. So at times it is confusing to understand what they are referring to. After I opened and pressed my seam allowance, I did not trim the seams like the instructions state to do. This is because I knew I would have to add the boning on. After measuring each seam allowance strip, I added up the inches, then divided that total by 36, because 36 inches is 1 yard, and determined that I needed 3.5 yards of boning. And after a trip to Joann's, I picked up this plastic boning that has a polyester slip or casing around it. This is the one the pattern recommends in the instructions. Once again, not on the back of the envelope in the notions where it should be. Still a little salty about that. I bought this boning that had a bigger slip at 5/8 because it was the first time I have ever worked with this type before, and I wanted as much room to work with. Also, I bought 4 yards of boning just in case I needed more. I have never said the word boning so much in my life before. It is so hard not to say that's what she said after every sentence. I first tested the process of sewing the boning on the middle side seam. Because this boning is plastic, it is easy to cut, so I measured out the seam, cut the boning, and pulled out the plastic boning out of its slip. It had this thread covering on it. I just removed it and never replaced it when I eventually slipped it back in. The instructions also say to use a zipper foot on the sewing machine for stitching on the boning slip, which my newer machine has, so I switched out the foot. I was a little confused with how they wanted me to sew on the slips. The directions seem like they want me to sew the slips right onto the bustier, but I did not want my stitching to be seen on the front. It might be okay if your fabric has a busy pattern though, but with the just simple black and white stripes I have, I decided that I did not want my stitching to be seen. So what I did do is fold the garment so that the seam was sticking out and only stitch together the slip and the seam. And because of the zipper foot, it was easier to do. After doing both sides of the slip, I trimmed the seam allowance, cut the plastic boning at 1/4 like the instructions state. This is because when sewing the main fabric and liner together, it prevents catching the boning and breaking the machine's needle. Curve, I slipped it in, and it seemed to work out just fine. So I moved on to the other slips and learned the reason why the instructions wanted me to do all the slips first is because the boning makes it more difficult to stitch things on because it curves the garment. After eventually getting all the slips pinned on, I did the same method of only sewing the seams and slips together. then trimming those seams, cutting the boning and slipping it in. And wow, I was surprised that this process was not as hard as I thought it was going to be. I was kind of dreading doing the boning because I never did anything like this before. I felt super accomplished after. Also, despite how much I talk about how important basting is, I did forget to baste the top and the bottom of the slips so the boning wouldn't fall out, but they didn't, so it worked out in the end. Next, they want me to sew together my liner the same way I did with the main fabric, of course, disregarding the interfacing and boning steps. After the liner was sewn together with the same method, I pressed the seams open and also the edges of the back pieces inwards towards the seam at 1/5. This is important for the hand sewing step that is at the very end. Pinning the pieces of the front and liner together, right side to right side. The directions instruct to fold over the main fabric onto the edge of the liner. This is important for when you have to sew the zipper on. I sewed together the main fabric and liner at the seam allowance for this pattern, which I forgot to mention before is 1/5, and this is only done at the top and the bottom of the bustier, so you can turn it right side out through the sides. Also, the whole making sure to cut your boning at 1/4 so your needle doesn't break thing. Yeah, so that happened. Anyways, after rectifying that situation, I finished sewing the top and bottom. I clipped the bottom of the garment where the instructions indicated to do so, trimmed the seams, and flipped it right side out. We are getting towards the end game of making the bustier. However, we are at my least favorite part. I switched back to the zipper foot, and it does make this process somewhat easier, and also this zipper breaks apart, so that helps. But I still had my struggles, and you will see that I did create an uneven seam. For some reason, this pattern wants me to fold over the flap on top of the zipper to the front, which I thought was a little weird, but whatever, I did it. And then I pinned it to the front of the bustier where the main fabric is and sewed it on. Then broke the zipper apart and did the same to the other side. Here is some advice I have about sewing on zippers that I learned through this process. When sewing on a zipper, make sure to sew it on with the main fabric facing up towards you and don't sew on the side where you can see the zipper. This helps prevent bunching of the main fabric that creates the look of an uneven seam like I did. That way, if you sew it with the main fabric facing towards you, you can catch and prevent any bunching at the zipper. And also stitch the zipper as slow as your machine will allow you to do so. So after the zipper is done, I needed to slip stitch the liner to the zipper, which was kind of hard to do because the zipper is a very thick fabric. But I eventually made it work. After I put the bustier on my dress form, the one seam on the zipper I messed up was really bugging me, so I decided to rip out that hand sewing and stitch the seam and redo it. But I did not film this because I wanted to focus on getting it right. I also did not do the last step of top stitching because I didn't want to break any more needles. And I also did not add buttons on the front because after asking some advice from my fellow crafter friends, they were worried that the buttons would clash with the buttons I had on the coat. So after I redid that seam and did some hand sewing, the process is done and it's time for the reveal. Alright, so the bustier part of the steampunk outfit is done. Overall, I would give this a slightly higher rating than I gave the coat part of the pattern, which was a B-. I would give this part of the pattern a B+ because it was a little less confusing with the instructions. However, once again, I would have liked some numbers on the picture diagrams, and the instructions of how to sew together these pieces of the fabric were a little confusing. Also, surprisingly, there is quite a bit of room up here. Usually I run into the opposite problem. Boning is fine, it feels comfortable. Just with most boning, I usually get some like pokes in this area, and that's not just with this bustier, that is usually with all bustiers. Do I think I can wear this bustier for the entirety of the Ren Fair when I go? Yes. I am personally happy that I made the decision not to add buttons because I felt like everyone was right. It would clash with these buttons down here. At first I was a little annoyed with this calico fabric, however, I in the end decided that I did like it, and you will see for part 3, which is making the skirt, I am going to make the skirt out of. So overall, I am happy with the end result of this bustier. This was the first time I worked with this much boning before, and it also did not take that long at all to make. Even though the instructions can be hard to read at times, the process still is doable. However, I still recommend if you are more at an intermediate level than a beginner level if you want to make this certain pattern. By the way, just a quick side note, if you would like a comparison, this is the first corset I ever made that doesn't have boning in it except right here. This had several pieces of boning in it. So yeah, I've never worked with this much boning before. That's what she said.